Dust drifted like ghosts over the dying town of Red Hollow. The year was 1873, and the only man with medicine left was Dr. Elias Crane, a man who'd seen too many graves and not enough gratitude. When the fever came, folks lined up at his door, clutching their last possessions, begging for mercy. But Crane didn't take money anymore, not after what it had cost him. "I'll save you," he said, voice cracked like dry timber, "but the land's mine." In that moment, salvation became a transaction, and redemption, a debt no one could repay. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. Dust stirred like old sins across Red Hollow, a slow, grinding particle that found its way into every breath and wound and prayer. The town that once answered the sun with work now answered it with sickness, and the sky wore the color of tired parchment. There had been a time when the square smelled of horses and coffee and the blacksmith's hammer, voices trading gossip, children chasing a hoop, but those sounds had shrunk to a hollow echo, swallowed by coughs. It began in whispers, a fever that stole the night's sleep, a cough that seemed to scratch at the ribs, then a thin, spreading hush. Men folded in the fields where they had always sown, wrists slick with sweat and dust, faces turned as if listening for some verdict from the heavens. Mothers leaned over kitchen tables and felt their own hearts pound like drums as their children's foreheads smoked with heat. They cupped little faces and tasted iron on their tongues and imagined grades where swings should have hung. The schoolhouse sat shuttered, its primer open on a single page, a chalk line frozen on the board. The teacher who had read the alphabet to 3 generations lay on his cot and did not rise. Panic is a patient thing. It moves through a town like fog, gentle at first, then suffocating. The church bell, which once called folk to hymns and promises, began tolling more often. Its sound no longer a comfort but a ledger, one knell for each lost life, one toll counting those already taken and those soon to be taken. People learned to read the bell's rhythm like a cruel metronome. Doors closed. Windows were latched. Yet the sick could not be hermetically sealed away. Illness has a way of knocking polite notions of safety clean off their hinges. By the 3rd week, Red Hollow's thoroughfares were lined with the unsteady and the bereaved. Men with calloused hands clasping newspapers as if the paper could be a shield. Women wrapping shawls tight and whispering the names of stains like passwords. Children with hollow bird eyes that watched the adults as if learning a new, terrible lesson about fragility. Someone took to standing at the crossroads with a tin cup and a message. "There is a doctor left," they said, "a single lamp in a town of houses now made of shadow." The name traveled like a rumor, Dr. Elias Crane. He had a reputation, half legend, half accusation, shaped by the same hands that used to praise him. There were those who called him savior and those who called him something else when the nights were long and the coffins lined up like tired soldiers. Dr. Elias Crane sat behind a scarred oaken table under the thin halo of a single guttering lamp. The clinic, a room of quiet industry where glass vials stood like patient witnesses and the mortar and pestle wore fingerprints like a confession. Light pooled on maps pinned to the wall, maps that once promised expansion and now only showed fences and the names of people he'd failed to keep. Once they had called him healer with praise on their tongues, and children had run in to watch his hands move. Now his name passed through Red Hollow like a rumor, half curse, half prayer, as if speaking it aloud might pull the fever back through the door. He worked the way a man carves a memorial, deliberate, ritualistic, avoiding the soft places in himself where memory hurt the most. The memory of her, the woman who had smiled with fatigue and fed a table of laboring men, whose hand had been warm in his the last night he held it, came in strange, sideways moments. The scent of boiled camel milk, the way a curtain caught a noon light, the precise soft curl of a child's hair. He had kept her name from the ledger. Her portrait, once on the wall, had been turned to the plaster years ago so visitors would not see him grieving and judge him for still loving. After she died, the arithmetic of compassion had shifted. Kindness without something to anchor it had nearly taken him under. So he began to measure mercy in acres and furlongs rather than coins. The ledger on his shelf was not inked with sums of silver but with parcels of dirt. a geometry of survival. Each signature a line in a map of obligations he told himself would save him from becoming the kind of man the town whispers about in the dark. Patients came now with deeds pressed to their chests like prayer books, with fingers stained by the soil they feared to lose, eyes bright with a terror that made words unnecessary. He read faces the way others read scripture, and he weighed each breath against the weight of the land he might gain, not out of hunger, he insisted to himself, but out of a cold calculus that claimed if he owned the earth he and those he allowed to stay might be sheltered when winter came heavy and cruel. He told himself stories to sleep, that he was preserving order, that a doctor who owned nothing could not bargain for medicine or for rivals. He told himself that bartering acres preserved families in a way money could not, because land stayed and gold ran like water. But solitary nights peeled these rationalizations thin. In the lamp's tremor his own hands looked like the hands of other men whose livelihoods had been carved out by hard choice, and sometimes, late, he would press the ledger to his chest and feel its pages rasping like a judgment. Dr. Elias Crane sat behind a scarred oaken table under the thin halo of a single guttering lamp. The clinic, a room of quiet industry where glass files stood like patient witnesses and the mortar and pestle-worn fingerprints like a confession. Light pulled on maps pinned to the wall, maps that once promised expansion and now only showed fences and the names of people he'd failed to keep. Once they had called him healer with praise on their tongues, and children had run in to watch his hands move. Now his name passed through Red Hollow like a rumor, half curse, half prayer, as if speaking it aloud might pull the fever back through the door. He worked the way a man carves a memorial, deliberate, ritualistic, avoiding the soft places in himself where memory hurt the most. The memory of her, the woman who had smiled with fatigue and fed a table of laboring men, whose hand had been warm in his the last night he held it, came in strange, sideways moments, the scent of boiled chamomile, the way a curtain caught a noon light, the precise soft curl of a child's hair. He had kept her name from the ledger. Her portrait, once on the wall, had been turned to the plaster years ago so visitors would not see him grieving and judge him for still loving. After she died, the arithmetic of compassion had shifted. Kindness without something to anchor it had nearly taken him under, so he began to measure mercy in acres and furlongs rather than coins. The ledger on his shelf was not inked with sums of silver but with parcels of dirt, a geometry of survival. Each signature a line in a map of obligations he told himself would save him from becoming the kind of man the town whispers about in the dark. Patients came now with deeds pressed to their chests like prayer books, with fingers stained by the soil they feared to lose, eyes bright with a terror that made words unnecessary. He read faces the way others read scripture, and he weighed each breath against the weight of the land he might gain, not out of hunger, he insisted to himself, but out of a cold calculus that claimed if he owned the earth he and those he allowed to stay might be sheltered when winter came heavy and cruel. He told himself stories to sleep, that he was preserving order, that a doctor who owned nothing could not bargain for medicine or for rivals. He told himself that bartering acres preserved families in a way money could not, because land stayed and gold ran like water. But solitary nights peeled these rationalizations thin. In the lamp's tremor his own hands looked like the hands of other men whose livelihoods had been carved out by hard choice, and sometimes, late, he would press the ledger to his chest and feel its pages rasping like a judgment. Conversation in his clinic was sparse, a cough, a whispered name, a child's wail, and when he did speak the sentences were small and sharp, a scalpel language meant to keep distance. "I'll save him," he had said once to a mother, voice dry as twig, "but the land's mine," and the words fell between them with the gravity of a verdict. He observed people like a man cataloging weather, how they bend, how they steeled themselves, how gratitude curdled into suspicion when a debt's ink dried, and yet when a child's chest finally rose easy after a treatment, when a widow clutched a warm hand and did not look back at the empty field, a part of him loosened, ashamed and relieved all at once. In the small hours he wandered the rooms of his clinic like a man pacing a ship's deck, counting not sails but the faces of those he might have saved sooner, of those he had not, and the ledger's quiet presence on his shelf became both pillow and indictment. He would run a finger down a line, see a name, a plot measured in chains, and imagine the hands that once tilled that soil folding in prayer, a folding in rage. Solitude had corroded the green edges of his empathy into a ledger-thin practicality, and the town's doorsteps, lined with those who hoped and those who feared him, became the measure by which he judged his own soul. And those moments, With the lamp low in the clinic smelling of boiled roots and old paper, Elias Crane understood that to be the only bearer of medicine in a dying place was to be given an awful coin, power, and that power had already begun to wear him into shapes he did not like. Red Hollow's porches became altars of desperation, each step a small confessional where neighbors unhooked the last bright thing they owned and laid it before a man who would become both hope and judge. Silver spoons, a mother's wedding band, a child's wooden horse, a dog-eared Bible, tokens that once signaled ordinary life, were offered with hands that shook so hard the items trembled like leaves in a storm. The gossip changed its shape and sharpened into accusation. Crane won't take cash, they said. He wants dirt. He takes fields for healings. He sits with a ledger instead of a heart. People spoke in the low register of those who know where the line between civility and savagery has thinned. Some whispered that the fever had roasted his soul away the way it had taken his wife, an explanation that let them give pain a reason. Others, harsher or more practical, said he was only like them, doing what a man must to keep warm in winter, bargaining to survive in a world where mercy doesn't pay rent. Yet desperation is its own language, and when your child's breath comes in a small, panicked rhythm, you learn to speak it fluently. So the wagons kept coming, rims thudding on mud, bringing the fevered and the fearful to Crane's lone lamp like moths to flame. They left their marks behind, deeds pressed to his table, signatures scrawled with hands that once wrestled plow hands and now could barely hold a pen. The signatures looked like confessions, small looping curses that would bind futures, and each stroke of ink folded futures down to the size of a paper square. People lined up along the dusty street, faces gaunt and eyes wide, their voices thin with the kind of pleading that ages a person by a decade in a single afternoon. Mothers stooped to the ground to collect the ashes of what used to be a pile of their harvest. Children clung to collars as if a father's shirt might hold them tethered to tomorrow, and widowers clenched their jaws because to beg is a thing that cuts a man down. The rule Crane enforced was unbending. There would be no charity, no sliding scale, no taking of trinkets in place of turf, only land, marked and mapped, acres surrendered for the right to live another dawn. That hard line turned gratitude into bargaining and worship into contracts. People who had once prayed for mercy found themselves signing away their pastures and orchards with hands that smelled of soil and a bitterness that the ink could never wash out. The town's language softened into a calculus of survival. How many acres buys a night of sleep? How much prairie secures a child's cough? Neighbors who once traded sugar and gossip now calculated the worth of a fence post against the warmth of an extra breath. Rumor slid between porches like snakes, that Crane staled himself while mothers wept, that he counted not only land but influence, that their parcels would become his, a map of one man's ascendance over a town's decline. Yet even the loudest whisperers kept their distance from a verdict when their own door rattled with fevered coughs. The letter's gravity was a kind of terror that rendered judgment impotent. Some tried to strike back. There were angry knights, tongues sharper than knives, a fist raised to demand justice. But anger without viability is wind, and the wind in Red Hollow found its way into coffins rather than into change. Within this desperate theater, the moral frames of people shifted subtly and then irrevocably. Gratitude curdled into suspicion, meekness hardened into bargaining power, love was measured in acres rather than in acts. And through it all, Crane remained a study in contradictions, his face more gaunt, his hands more precise. When he treated a child successfully, a dull, sickly relief would pass through him, part triumph, part humiliation, because each saved life birthed another line in the ledger and another story of loss for someone else. At night the town listened for the bell not as a call to prayer but as accusation, and in the early fog fathers and mothers stood by their windows watching the clinic lamp like a distant promise or a trap. They asked themselves what they would do if their own signatures were demanded, and in those asking they tasted both the sharpness of survival and the sour aftertaste of a soul made small by a necessity. Martha Harlan arrived at dusk with a prayer in her mouth and Hassan's fever in her arms. The road to Dr. Crane's clinic a ribbon of churned dust that seemed to swallow the last light. She moved like someone carrying too many small losses at once, her hair braided thin, the hem of her dress frayed, a deed folded in one hand like a letter she could not bear to open. The boy's skin flamed beneath a threadbare blanket. He clenched his small fists in sleep that was more a fitful drift than rest. And when Martha sat him down on Crane's examination cot, she watched his chest rise and fall as if counting heartbeats might keep the fever at bay. The clinic smelled of boiled herbs and old paper and the metallic clang of remedies Crane still mixed by hand. The lamp's light trembled across glass syringes and a battered mortar, and in that light Crane looked older than the town remembered, his beard thinner, his eyes rimmed with sleepless calculation. She did not ask for more than mercy. She did not plead with the elaborate rhetoric of hope. Only, "Please," she said, voice small as a thread, "it's all I have." In her hand was the deed, one small plot the Harlans had scratched from prairie and hard seasons, not much on a map but everything to her, and she offered it to him with the humility of someone bearing an old wound. Crane studied the paper like a man reading the last page of a book he had been avoiding. The ink was smudged in one corner where her thumb had rubbed it raw. He thought of value. The land was modest, low, a strip of sunburned earth and a lean barn. Hardly a fortune. He thought of cost. The ledger on his shelf had grown into a map of obligations that promised, in cold arithmetic, shelter against winters that bit deeper each year. The memory of his wife rose then, unbidden and sharp, the small sound she made when she slept, the way her fingers had found as in the dark the night fever took him. He had failed to pry fate from its jaws once, and that failure braided itself into every decision since. Martha's eyes met his. They were steady not with accusation but with exhausted hope, and in them he read not only his wife's echo but the soft geometry of faith a mother builds around a child. The room contracted around the exchange. Outside the bell tolled distant and indifferent, breath and rustle and the slow, deliberate tick of a clock that seemed to judge time by heartbeats. He could refuse. He had refused before in the logic of survival. He could offer medicine for silver, for labor, for promises he might never cash. Instead the words came like a scalpel between them, concise and dry, "I'll save him. But the land's mine." This sentence landed with an authority he had not meant to show, and for a heartbeat the world narrowed to the space between Martha's hands and his, between that small paper and the boy's shallow breathing. Martha's mouth opened, then folded. She did not weep theatrically, did not collapse into melodrama. Her gratitude was a quiet, bone-deep thing that trembled in her chest. "You'll take it?" she asked, voice thin. "Yes," he answered, voice rough as winter wood. He set to work with the methodical movements of a man who has rehearsed mercy until it feels like machinery, a poultice of willow bark, a tonic that tasted of iron and hope, the precise stitch of a bandage placed where fever-burned veins close to the skin. The boy's breathing jagged then eased in small measures. The lamp threw a soft halo on the small face, and for a suspended, almost impossible instant Crane felt the warm loosening of something heavy inside him, a relief that tasted like shame. After the fever-broken dawn lifted the first cold light, Martha, cradling her son, pressed the deed into Crane's hands as if she could slide the memory into the paper itself. "It's all I have," she said again, and in those words there was no bargaining, only a raw human arithmetic, life measured in acres. Crane watched her go, the ledger in his mind accepting the new line with the same quiet inevitability as the seasons. And when the clinic door shut behind them, he found himself standing over an empty cup of tea thinking of graves and promises, of the way a man's measure of mercy could become the measure of his survival, and of how a single sentence, "I'll save you." But the land's mind could transform a simple act of healing into the first entry of a map that would come to hold an entire town's fate. Lamplight trembled across the clinic walls, throwing long, fever-colored shadows that crawled and folded with each flicker of the flame, and in that unsteady glow, Dr. Elias Crane moved like a man haunted by both duty and memory. The boy's skin gleamed with sweat, his breaths rasping shallow and uneven, every exhale a fragile thread that might snap with the next cough. Crane's hands, practiced yet trembling, measured the last of his tonic, a bitter mix of ground wahoo bark, quinine, and whatever remnants of faith he could grind into it. And for a moment, as he stirred, the sound reminded him of his wife's last night, the same fever, the same rhythm of gasping lungs that had rewritten the course of his soul. Martha stood silent beside the cot, her face pale, her hands clasped at her chest as though she could hold the world together with sheer will. He worked in silence, listening to the boy's pulse, his eyes catching glints of the land deed resting on the edge of the table, paper and ink, waiting for the trade to seal itself. Outside, the wind pressed against the shutters, carrying the hollow sound of the town's unrest, the whispers of the living talking about death like it was a neighbor. Hours slipped by like sand through a cracked glass, and when the boy's breathing deepened, the fever breaking in soft, stuttering sighs. The weight in the room shifted, the kind of relief that hurts because it costs something too dear to name. Martha's hand flew to her mouth, a sob escaping her before she could stop it, and she dropped to her knees beside the cot, whispering thanks to a God who had grown quiet these past months. Crane stepped back, his shoulders heavy, his eyes drawn again to the lantern where the flame bent low, clinging to life like the boy had. Gratitude filled the space, warm and fragile, until Martha, shaking, reached for the deed lying forgotten on the table. "You've done God's work tonight," she said, voice small but steady. "You've saved my boy." The land. But Crane's face changed then, his jaw tightening, the line between compassion and survival reasserting itself like a wound reopening. He took the paper in one motion, folding it cleanly, the sound of the crease louder than it should have been. "A deal's a deal," he said, his tone flat, final. Martha froze, the echo of his words hanging in the air like smoke after gunfire. Her gratitude collapsed into something brittle. She looked at him, seeing not savior but man, and the space between them filled with all the things neither dared to speak. The price of mercy, the shape of grief when dressed as commerce. The boy stirred, half awake, his small voice calling for her, and she gathered him into her arms with the tenderness that Crane could not look at for long. She whispered again, "Thank you," though it came out like surrender, and when she turned to leave, her shadow crossed his ledger shelf, long and narrow, stretching across the names of others who had traded land for life. The door closed behind her with a sound that hollowed the room. Crane stood alone, the folded deed still in his hand, feeling its weight like a confession he couldn't absolve. Outside, Red Hollow was already breathing rumors into the wind, that the doctor cured the sick with one hand and took their soil with the other, that every acre saved from death was bought with despair, that his ledger wasn't just paper, but a graveyard waiting to bloom. Lantern light flickered again, and in its brief flare, Crane saw his reflection in the window, pale, blind, and older than he remembered, a man who had become both healer and harvester, mending bodies while burying trust. He set the deed carefully beside the others and extinguished the flame. The darkness rushed in quick, absolute, like the closing of a book he could no longer bear to read. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. Weeks unspooled like braided rope, each day adding a new twist to the town's mood into the map that lived in Crane's ledger. At dawn the clinic door would open to a line of faces, some gaunt and hollow with fear, others hardened by the necessity of bargaining, and by dusk the ledger's pages would be heavier, edges soft with the constant handling of deeds and signatures, each name a small thumbprint of survival that made his shelf look less like a medicine chest and more like a tax roll of grief. At first the trades had the furtive hush of something almost sacred, neighbors clasping hands, whispering thanks, the quick, desperate scribble of ink. But as weeks became months the ritual calcified into routine. The same hands that once passed sugar and gossip now passed paper and obligation, and the town itself seemed to fold inward, its borders shrinking as one by one homesteads were recorded beneath Crane's need, cruel script. People rationalized in private, telling themselves tales fit to soothe conscience. My land is no use to me if I'm dead, better that the doctor holds it than it sits empty and wasted. Crane repeated these justifications to himself like a prayer one might say to sleep: survival, order, stewardship, words that sounded less like truth and more like plasters over a wound. He swore he did not grow richer. He claimed that what he collected would be stewarded for the town's good, that fences taken into his name would prevent sprawl, would keep cattle from straying into ruin, would be held until the fever was gone. And perhaps at first he meant it, a fragile truth softened by fear. Yet each signature etched itself into his skin as if ink had a way of embedding itself into bone. He saw the curl of Mrs. Whitaker's hand trembling as she signed over the back lot where her roses grew. He felt the set of old Jeb's jaw as he surrendered the north pasture. He watched a boy's first, shaky scrawl for a plot so small it might have been a garden and felt a sudden, sharp nausea. The ledger grew not only in pages but in meaning. What had been a line in a book became a line in a community's future, a rewriting of inheritance, a reweaving of safety nets into a single man's map. At night the town seemed diminished. Windows that used to throw warm light into the street now held only the pale glare of lanterns, and the spaces between houses looked like gaps where people who had once trusted one another. Crane tried to sleep, but the ledger's presence was a quiet accusation at the edge of every dream. Hands signing, children calling, fields emptying. He began to notice the small changes in himself, the way his voice had grown clipped when he spoke to bleeding mothers, the way his fingers hesitated before pressing a pen to paper as if they, too, feared what they might set into motion. He told himself that he was not trading souls for soil, that the arithmetic of survival required hard choices. Yet late in the cold hours he would lift the ledger to the lamp and watch the ink catch the light and wonder at the geometry of all those surrendered acres. Gossip swelled into rumor and rumor into resentment. Neighbors who had once shared potatoes now cast sidelong eyes at the parcels Crane had collected, and some men muttered that where there had been gratitude there was now a slow rotting betrayal. A few nights, when the wind came in hard from the plains and slammed the shutters, groups gathered in the square and argued fiercely. Should they demand their deeds back, or would that be to consign their sick to death? And always the practical voice won. Fear, like the fever, had a way of turning moral outrage into silence. Crane tried to balance the ledger with acts of care, to soothe himself by adjusting doses, by staying later, by teaching a mother how to steep quinine properly. But each act of good seemed to press the ledger's weight down heavier, like a scale that would never truly balance. The town shrank under the arithmetic, less land per family, fewer gardens, smaller herds, and with each contraction the human stories multiplied. Grandfathers who would never see the ground they tilled again, children whose futures were roofed by a stranger's name, mouths of graves widened by one more winter. Conscience tightened around Crane like a rope pulled taut. He could name reasons, he could map necessities, but when he closed his eyes he could not escape the shape of signatures moving across the page, each one a small, irrevocable cutting away of the place he once swore to protect, until he began to wonder if his oath had been rewritten not by him but by the town's own hunger for survival, and whether survival itself had become the very thing that would break them. Dusk folded over Red Hollow like a slow, deliberate curtain, and the clinic lamp threw a small, stubborn circle of light into the approaching dark when the rider came. A man on a gray horse, polished boots, a coat that did not carry the dust of this road but the sheen of other places. He rode with the economy of one accustomed to travel through offices and courtrooms rather than fields, and when he dismounted his smile was a practiced one, the kind that measures conversation before it begins. Ezra Pike introduced himself with a tilt of his hat and a voice that could have been velvet if velvet carried knives. "Name's Ezra Pike," he said. "Courier for the land office. Just been sent through to assess property claims and ease any mixed titles." The town, a thin spine of porchlight and shuttered windows, watched like a jury. Crane rose from his stool with a careful reserve, his hands showing the calluses of healing, his posture the guarded line of a man who has learned negotiation as part of medicine when scarcity rules. Pike's eyes scanned the ledger on the table as if it were a map of territories to be parceled out, and a small, almost indifferent smile played at the corner of his mouth. "Doctor," Pike said, leaning that smile into the room like a question, "you've built yourself quite an empire from misery." The words landed soft and cold. Crane's jaw tightened. His mouth made a line against the tide of accusation. "Someone had to keep the land from dying," he said, and his voice tried to be practical. There was the ring of a man who had rehearsed excuses until they felt like truth. Pike only smirked, as if he smelled an easier tale to sell, or from the living. The pinch in the room grew deeper. Outside, the wind carried the low murmur of people and the faint skang of a bell, and inside, the exchange opened like a wound. Pike was not a man of immediate threats. He was a man of paper and procedure, of notices and the backhanded power that bureaucracy can bring. He talked about titles and claims, about the peculiar legal weight that accrues when deeds change hands under duress, about how the law sometimes prefers tidy ledgers to messy pleas, and his words, precise and courteous, were barbs wrapped in civility. "It's unusual," he observed, fingers tapping the ledger, "for so many to consolidate under one private name during a public emergency." There was no rush in his tone, only a gourmand's relish in the savor of scandal, and he watched Crane with the patience of a predator that knows its prey may not yet realize it is trapped. Crane answered in sparse sentences, his explanation, stewardship, preservation, protection from absentee landlords, was furnished with the kind of grim earnestness that can persuade until it does not. Pike listened, then unfolded another layer. The state had an interest in maintaining the freehold pattern of frontier settlements, in preventing single men from gaining undue influence by acquiring parcels under emergency conditions. "We don't like to see power concentrated," Pike remarked, "even if it's bought with pressing need." The implication was a legal one wrapped with a moral sheen, the thinnest of veils. Tension threaded the lamp-lighted room. Crane had always presumed his ledger to be a shield, a bulwark against chaos. Now it read to Pike like a fuse leading to a charge. Outside, the people murmured that law had finally arrived to keep a single man from turning a calamity into dominance. Inside, Crane felt the ledger burn curled under his skin. Pike's parting smile was casual, but his final words were precise. "You've done well for yourself, Doctor." For now, he left the way he had come, riding with a sure rhythm, and the silence he left behind was thick as wet earth. Crane watched him go until horse and rider blurred into the horizon, and then he returned to the ledger as if to test its weight. Each name seemed to press into the page with a different force now, like coins stamped with a face that once promised safety but might now mean bondage. The arrival of Ezra Pike was a pivot. It turned private barter into public concern and cast Crane's hard choices into a new light. No longer merely survival tactics, but actions that could be judged under a law that did not know their grief. Crane told himself the legal men did not understand the scent of panic, the small economies of desperation. Yet the thought that his patchwork of protection might be unpicked by statutes filled him with a cold, unfamiliar fear. And for the first time since his wife's grave, he wondered if the oath he had taken had been replaced by a contract he could not live with. By the next sunrise, Pike's presence had spread through Red Hollow like wildfire, licking through dry brush, feeding on fear, pride, and envy until it consumed the fragile gratitude that had once shielded Dr. Elias Crane. The townsfolk, already brittle with loss, found in Pike's polished insinuations a mirror for their anger. What they saw reflected back was not their own desperation, but the man who had profited from it. Conversations once whispered over fences now burst like storm clouds in the square, stories twisted and repeated until they took on the weight of truth. They said Crane had hoarded medicine, that his cures were nothing more than diluted hope poured into glass bottles. They said he'd used fever as leverage, that he'd chosen who would live based on whose land he fancied. In the saloon, voices rose in coarse laughter that didn't sound like humor. At the church steps, faces that had once bowed their heads for his wife's funeral now looked away as he passed. Children, sensing the shift in air, mimicked their parents and pointed at the man who had once mended their broken arms, whispering his name as though it were an omen. Crane tried to tell himself it was the fever speaking through them still. That desperation rewrote memory, that the mind, when wounded, finds villains to heal its pride, but the words hold in his throat. He had saved them, hadn't he? He had never turned anyone away. He repeated that like a commandment, yet even as he said it, the weight of the ledger on his shelf seemed to contradict him. Each deed he had taken had been signed willingly. He had not forced a hand, not one. But the difference between choice and coercion grew murky in hindsight, like river water muddying after rain. He found himself staring at his own hands as though they belonged to someone else, rough, cracked, and blistered from years of labor in inchers, trembling faintly under the lantern's tremor. Once, those hands had healed for the joy of it, for the purity of craft, the miracle of reversing death's slow pull. But now they shook not with fatigue but with a tremor of guilt. The fine line between mercy and power had faded so gradually that he hadn't noticed the crossing until it was miles behind him. He remembered the first deed, the widow with the trembling boy, and how righteous he felt. Convincing himself he was saving both lives and land, he told himself that it was stewardship. He told himself again when the second and third followed. But now, hearing Pike's voice echo in his mind, an empire for misery, the words scraped raw against the truth. He hadn't built an empire. He'd built a monument to his own fear of losing control. That fear had become his religion. Outside, torches moved through the fog like restless eyes. People gathered in small clusters, their silhouettes shifting, their words indistinguishable but sharp. He imagined what they were saying, that he had killed as many as he had cured, that the fever had never been real, that the medicine was nothing but water and willpower. Rumors are a fever of their own, spreading without cure, and soon the town's pulse beat to their rhythm. Crane sat by his desk, the ledger open, each line of ink looking like a vein carved into the paper's skin. He traced the names with a fingertip, remembering faces, their relief, their trembling gratitude. They were unwilling tears, and for the first time, he saw not a record of survival, but a catalog of penance. These weren't debts owed to him, they were sins shared between him and the dying. The lamplight flared low, sputtering in its oil, and in its brief flicker he saw himself reflected in the clinic's window, drawn, hollow-eyed, his expression not of defiance but of weariness. He whispered, "I never turned anyone away," but the silence that followed felt like judgment. In that silence, the boundaries of right and wrong blurred entirely, and he understood that power, once baptized in desperation, is never innocent again. The fever returned like a tide that knew the town's weak places, a sharper, more cunning sickness that rode in on a colder wind and found purchase where the last strain had thin defenses. And within days Red Hallow's shutter shook with a new kind of dread. This time the cough was wet and predatory, taking breath from lungs that had learned to hoard air, and mothers pressed handkerchiefs to faces as if paper could fill a contagion. Crane felt it first as an ache behind his ribs, a small, insistent drum that grew louder with each patient he saw. His hand, once steady with the ritual of savage and measured doses, began to shake with the same tremor he'd watched in others, and one morning, while mixing what remained of his quinine, he spat a thin ribbon of blood into his palm and understood with a clarity that was more horror than revelation. He was not immune. Panic folded over the town like black cloth. People who had signed deeds into his ledger now returned to his door not as supplicants offering paper, but as supplicants offering anything. Promises, labor, their last silver. But the ledger's pages, stacked like a fortress on the shelf, seemed suddenly futile, their ink impotent against a body's failing chemistry. Men who had once cursed his name now looked at him with an almost childlike plea. "Doc, please." He had no potion left that could promise life. His cupboard of remedies had been ground down by months of use, by poor harvests, by the cruel arithmetic that denied resupply. Even the herbs Martha had once brought could only soothe fevered throats for a breath or two. The sense of being essential, so long a cloak that he had wrapped about his shoulders, peeled away, revealing a man in his nightshirt and stained coat, dizzy with the knowledge that he could not mend what now sickened him. The irony of the ledger sat on his shelf like a mute accusation. Acres signed in exchange for nights of life, but acres do not breathe, and paper cannot staunch a lung. People he had saved came back with hollowed faces, children clinging to skirts, fathers with the vacant blankness of those who have had to watch and wait. They pressed their hands to his, as if touch could conjure remedies, as if the man's palm still held some transference of health. He wanted to give them assurance. Instead he offered what he could, simple instructions, a weary touch, a promise he could no longer trust. The fever did not care for explanations. It took its work with the patient impartiality of nature. Nights became a blur of coughing and the metallic scent of blood and the soft, terrible sound of machines the town did not own. Worn ropes of community pulled taut and sometimes snapping. Crane himself counted breaths as if counting could translate into action, and many times he miscounted, the numbers slipping like whetstones from his fingers. In the street the bell tolled in irregular, terrified rhythms. People spoke in breathless fragments, the language of shock and anger interlaced. Why did we sign? Why did we trust? The ledger's authority, once a kind of law, unraveled into a shabby mockery before the clinical cruelty of contagion. Ezra Pike's earlier words, about empire, about law, felt distant and petty next to the primordial business of survival. Men who had envied Crane's holdings now found that ownership was a thin shelter indeed. Land cannot cure fever, titles are not anecdotes. As the sick multiplied, the social fabric frayed. Neighbors who had bartered with Crane questioned each other in hushed fury, looking for someone to blame. Accusation is a fever with its own pathology. It finds a host and makes them contagious with outrage. Crane, fevered and weak, stumbled through the clinic, feeling the ledger's weigh like dead wood against his ribs. And there came a moment when a mother, her face stricken with grief and rage, asked him with a rawness that cut through the haze, "What good was our giving you our land?" There was no answer that could stitch that wound. He had lived believing an oath could be measured, that stewardship might replace charity. But lying in the same sickroom as his patients, coughing and burning, he understood the ledger meant nothing. Its pages were paper, its promises the fantasies of a man who had tried to buy permanence in an impermanent world. In the end, the town learned a brutal lesson. When fever comes, you do not need a landowner, you need medicine and care, and when those run out, all contracts dissolve into the same desperate plea for breath, for another sunrise, for someone to make the hands stop shaking. Martha returned at dawn when Red Hollow was still a study in gray patience, the boy by her side taller by the span of weeks and steadier on his feet. His cough a memory she guarded like a scar. She carried no deed this time, no faded paper to trade, only a small bottle of dried herbs wrapped in oilcloth and a steadiness in her gaze that made the clinic feel, for a moment, less like a ledger's vault and more like a place where hands might be trusted again. The boy's skin had a healthy color now. He held his mother's hand without fear, and when he looked at Crane it was with the blunt gratitude of someone who had been given a second morning. Martha's voice was low and without the bargaining edge that had driven her first visit. "You saved him," she said, as if stating what had already been done. Then, quieter, "Now let us save you." The words landed like a small, unfamiliar blessing and Crane felt his pride crack like old ice underfoot. He had wrapped himself in armor, ledgers, deeds, the practical calculus of survival, and that armor had become a cage she pretended was necessary. She stepped into the clinic with a plain courage that met his own jagged and brittle defenses. She did not come to accuse or to beg, only to offer remedy in the simplest form she had. Herbs she'd learned to dry from her mother, poultices she'd bartered for with neighbors, hands calloused not by ink but by planting. He resisted at first because resisting is muscle memory for a man who has learned to keep distance, who equates reliance with weakness. He thought of the ledger, of the acres that steadied his winter, of the legal man who had ridden through with soft threats and keener questions. Pride, he discovered, is a stubborn fever that runs deeper than the one outside. Martha pressed his hand, no ceremonials gesture, only touch, and whispered, "No one owns grace, doctor." There was no theatricality in it, only a truth edged with humility. In that whisper something in him unclenched. Years of measured mercy and cold calculations loosened like knots cut with a blade. She set down the bottle and began to tend him with a steadiness that felt like returning to a forgotten language. She brewed a bitter tea that smelled of earth and rain and coaxed him to drink. She laid a cool cloth upon his brow, and she cleaned his wounds with water warmed between her palms. The ritual so ordinary it stripped the moment of any ledgered value. The boy, now adept at small kindnesses, fetched water and bolstered the lamp while Crane, fevered and ragged, let his hands rest in someone else's. Martha told stories in a whisper, about the first spring the Harlans planted corn, about how her husband had whistled while fixing a fence, about small triumphs that had nothing to do with land ownership. And in those stories Crane found an ache that was not his alone but a shared geography of loss and stubborn hope. She did not demand restitution. She did not speak of deeds or debts. Instead, she handed over a notion he had long misplaced, that healing could be reciprocal, that the person who mends may also be mended, and that community was not a ledger but a living thing. Around them the town hummed with its own grief and the slow, dangerous calculus of survival. But in the small light of the clinic a quieter barter took place, one not measured in acres but in hours spent, in boiled broth given freely, in the replacing of distance with touch. Crane felt shame and gratitude in equal measure. His throat closed at the simplicity of her offering, at the way the boy leaned against his knee and fell asleep as if the world had righted itself. That night, as Martha and the child left, the morning sun unfurled pale and clean over Red Hollow and Crane sat with the bottle until dawn, turning it in his hands like a relic of a truer economy. He opened the ledger and, for the first time since the feverish shadow had fallen, hesitated before adding a name. The pages no longer presented themselves as maps of power but as records of living people, and the seams between his duty and his humanity, worn thin by necessity and fear, began, perhaps, to stitch back together. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. Night had a fever of its own when Crane stumbled back to the clinic, the chill of the poor chair doing nothing to cool the heat that pulsed under his ribs, and the lamp he lit shivered like a guilty thing as if even light could not steady him. He placed the lantern on the scarred table and sat, the ledger before him an altar of choices, pages fanning like thin, patient wings, each line a name that tasted like ash in his mouth. His hands, those hands that had sutured skin and set broken bones, trembled not from the fever alone but from the gravity of what they had carried: signatures, deeds, the geometry of survival written in ink and breath. He touched the paper as one might touch a grave, fingertips grazing cursive that had once meant hope and now read like indictment. Outside, the town slept in a brittle hush, but the bell tolled somewhere far off, a slow, steady knell that had always counted bodies. Tonight its tone seemed different, as if it sought not to mark an ending but to call something else into being. He remembered Martha's voice, "No one owns grace," and the memory was a blade and a bomb at once. The ledger had grown heavy in his absence from himself. It lay there like a map drawn by a man who had lost his way. He thought of the widows who had signed, of the boy who had lived and whose small hand had once curled around his ingratitude, of the men who muttered threats and then returned to beg, of the clean-faced man in polished boots who had smiled as he left. Guilt is a peculiar currency. It presses and steals at once, and tonight it brought him nothing but the conviction that he could not atone. He pulled the ledger toward him as if it were an object to be examined under confession, and the light found the smudges of tears he had denied, the coffee ring where he'd paused once to think, the faintly anxious scroll of names that had been signed while hands shook. The act of tearing a page is small and sacramental. The sound is both intimate and final. He tore the first sheet slowly, feeling its fibers resist, and the sound startled him like a shot. He held the paper over the lantern and watched the edge curl, blacken, go to flame. The first whisper of smoke rose, sweet and terrible, and in it he imagined the faces of those he had saved and the faces of those who had lost more than they knew to do so. One by one he did it, page after page, a procession of confession. But there was no page that erased the past. There was only the act, the small ritual of undoing that felt like both penance and surrender. With each curled edge devoured by the light, his chest loosened and tightened in turns, like a bellows working and then breaking. The ledger's weight slipped from the shelf of his conscience and fell into the fire where it smoked and hissed as if the night itself objected to such absolution. He did not burn them to hide evidence. He burned them to change the ledger into something else, into ash that could nourish soil, if he let it, into a symbol that he would not again measure mercy in titles and survey lines. The flame claimed everything. Ink ran in tiny black tears and lifted, as if the words themselves were fleeing the page. Outside, the church bell kept time and people stirred in their sleep as if a wind had turned in the town's chest. The sound of the bell moved toward him, persistent and insistent, and when it tolled its rhythm no longer felt like a counting but like a summons to wakefulness. He thought of the oath he had taken once, of a younger hand steady over a scalpel, of vows meant to be simple and pure. Ledger had been an accretion of fear and method, a monument to a man's attempt to control what cannot be controlled. Standing there, fevered and shaking, he pushed the last ashes aside and felt something like lightness and a terror that followed it. Rebirth is never clean, never certain, and the town would have questions, and men like Ezra Pike would have eyes. But for the first time in months he understood that a man could choose to stop collecting other people's lives as if they were currency, that to shred his own claim was perhaps the closest thing to restitution he could offer. The bell tolled again and the sound was less like counting and more like calling. He sat in the dim and let the smoke curl around him, and as the lantern burned lower he found himself whispering the names of those pages into the dark, not to erase them but to remember why he had once become a healer, not to own the land, but to tend the people upon it. Flames took the clinic like a truth that could no longer be hidden, licking at the shingles and sending a bloom of orange into the night sky while the town gathered in a ragged ring of faces, lanterns bobbing like small, guilty stars. No one moved to stop it. Some watched with wary relief, some with horror, and some with a kind of stunned curiosity at the spectacle of paper and promise unmaking itself. The fire made an odd, clarifying light. It showed the lines of faces, the aged brows, the way grief had carved hollows where laughter used to be. And as the ledger's edges curled and went to black, the signatures swelled and stuttered into smoke. For a moment the whole town seemed to inhale, as if it, too, held its breath to see whether paper could burn away wrong. Children pushed at their parents' skirts and were hushed. Old men with fists like knots clutched their hats. Women crossed themselves in motions half hope, half astonishment. And somewhere a bell rang on, at first a single dull toll, then more urgent, as if struck by hands trying to wake the sleeping. The fire did not discriminate. It consumed the prints of hope and the instruments of judgment in a single indifferent appetite. Crane stood with the others at the edge of the light, his coat singed at the hem, his face drawn in a feverish pallor that made him look both punished and absolved, and he watched the ashes rise like confessions. He had expected pity perhaps, or accusation, or even the quiet satisfaction of retribution from those who had murmured that his dominance had been a theft. Instead, there was a hush that felt like a new kind of reckoning, public and raw. Ezra Pike came back, the weighman returned when the law smelled scandal, deliberate, efficient, the leather of his boots clean, his expression a mask of administrative chill. He dismounted as if practiced, walked through the crowd with that polite gravity of a man accustomed to having doors opened for him and opinions shifted to suit his pen. And when he stopped before Crane, the air was tight enough to cut. Pike's voice was a blade wrapped in paper. "You burned your fortune," he said, sharp and precise, as though reciting a clause from a ledger he favored. The words dropped into the night like a stone into still water. Crane, ash on his cuffs, the smell of smoke stuck in his hair, looked at the man who had once smiled and judged and now stood with the audacity of law behind him and felt, for the first time, something like clarity. He met Pike's eyes and heard in his own small voice the echo of every hand that had placed a deed upon his table. "No," Crane replied, and the single word was not defensive but freed. "I freed it." Around them the crowd murmured, a sound like wind in dry grass, and the meaning of Crane's answer moved through the ring like a slow, spreading warmth. The plots, the signatures, the legal leverage, gone. Pike's mouth tightened. His authority, which had built itself on the control of property and the tidy enforcement of rights, had nothing left to hold. "What you did is obstruction," Pike said, folding his hands into a pose of calm that failed to mask the crease of anger. "You destroyed evidence." Crane felt the tremor of his own newly lightened chest and answered without the ledger's defensive arithmetic. "I destroyed a claim to ownership that was made while people were bleeding and scared. You want to seize land that was given under duress?" He did not shout. His voice cut like a scalpel because it had learned the economy of few words. The town listened, some with hard faces, some with wet eyes, and in that silence the argument turned less on law and more on something older, the ethics of a desperate exchange. Pike recited statutes, the cold grammar of a state that values titles because titles make order. He warned of penalties and legal consequences, of courts and judgments that could be brought against men who burned property records. Crane folded his arms not in defiance but in a weary acceptance of whatever would come. His throat was raw but his hands no longer clenched with the ledger's weight. "Take me to court," he said quietly. "I will tell them why I did it." Murmurs rose, some approving, some doubtful. But the night had shifted. Where once there had been a man's empire, now there was only a man and a pile of ash that smelled faintly of redemption. Pike looked at the blackened paper, at the faces around him, and for the first time the law seemed cumbersome next to the town's raw need to breathe without the ledger pressing on their necks. He signed no warrant that night. He left with a promise to consider, which was a bureaucrat's version of waiting. The people of Red Hollow did not cheer. They simply filed back to their houses with eyes that had seen something irreversible. And Crane, standing alone by the cooling embers, felt the ledger's burn settle into his skin like a scar that would remind him of both ruin and release. Dawn came in on a wry breath, and Red Hollow woke to a town washed in the pale, careful light of survival. Smoke still curled thin over the clinic roof like a memory that would not quite leave, and where nights before had been stitched with coughs and the bells accounting, there was now an uneasy, astonished quiet as if the world had been given a second, tentative chance. The fever's grip loosened like a fist, unclenching, slow, uncertain, miraculous to some, merely the work of chance to others. But whatever its cause, people stepped out onto porches and into the street with the raw, surprised air of those who have been spared a calamity and are not yet certain what to do with their gratitude. Crane lay on a narrow pallet near the clinic's scorched window, his breath shallow but steady, skin still warm from fever and from the work of confessing. He had the look of a man who had been unmade and reassembled, gaunt, eyes rimmed in red, and somehow softer where hard lines had lived. Martha moved about him with the gentle competence of someone who knows how to keep a household whole. She washed his face with water warmed over coals, smoothed a blanket across his knees, and tied a clean cloth around his head to catch the sweat. Her boy, taller now and steadier, kept on with small errands, fetching water, hauling herbs, holding the lantern when the light dimmed. and there was an economy to their movements that felt like prayer. Neighbors passed quietly, their faces unreadable. Some brought bread, some a jar of preserved peaches, some simply held back and watched as if learning how to be neighbors again. Conversation drifted in fragments. It was the fire, people said, or perhaps the change of wind. It was providence, it was fate, it was the slow tipping of one set of choices into another. The priest at the church murmured about providence and panics. Old men in the square argued about law and order and whether any one man should hold so much sway. But mostly there was a new, fragile attention paid to small mercies, a child's cough that did not turn into wheezing, a farmer's hand that steadied enough to milk a cow, a widow returning to her plot to find new sprouts where she had feared only dust. Crane, weak and honest in the dull light, watched them with a strange detachment that was not numbness but a kind of dawning clarity. He thought of ledger pages gone to ash and of the weight that had been removed from his chest by the very burning. He thought of the faces that had signed their futures away and of how their signatures had felt both like salvation and like theft. He thought, too, of his wife, how the memory of her opened in certain small moments like a wound and then closed again with the sap of action. Martha sat by his side, and when he slept she hummed soft, unassuming songs that reminded him of kitchens and children and afternoons being alive rather than of courts and claims. He had expected contempt when he opened his eyes, or at least resentment. Instead he felt, in the tilt of people's heads and in the quiet kindness of those who brought him bowls of soup, an odd, uncosted peace. It was not a triumph. It was not redemption neatly arrived at. It was a calm that follows honest work, messy and incomplete but true. The town moved like a body learning a new gait, awkward, sometimes stumbling, but moving. A council would meet, and Azra Pike would write reports and perhaps bring legislation. But for now the urgent had been answered and the immediate need subsided into breathing, a different kind of labor. Children played at the edge of the square, tentative as birds testing their wings. Crane felt the boy's small hand slip into his, warm and alive, and for the first time in a long while he let his fingers close without measuring the cost. Martha's eyes met his, and in them he read not pity but a heart, steady forgiveness that had no accounting ledger. He did not know what would come, courts, reckonings, the long repair of trust, but lying there under the thin, blue dawn he understood that some things, once burned, returned not as the same object but a soil where new things might take root. The bell, which had been a metronome of loss, tolled now in a rhythm that no longer counted bodies but called people toward work and toward one another. Outside, Red Hollow exhaled for the first time in months, tentative and trembling and then deeper, like a town discovering it could breathe again. Spring worked like a careful hand over Red Hollow, and the town that had bowed under the fever's weight began, in small and stubborn ways, to uncurl. Fences that once stood like declarations of ownership were loosened and taken down by neighbors who moved with the deliberate rhythm of people learning to share air and soil again. And where ledgered lines had once divided families, hands now met across the seams to plant seed. The fields, which had felt like battlegrounds of survival when deeds were bartered like blood money, softened into rows of green, corn, beans, a patchwork of vegetables that smelled like future dinners and ordinary hope. And children ran barefoot between them, small ghosts of the seasons to come, shouting at one another as if the memory of the bell had become a lesson rather than a sentence. Men and women who had once signed their names with ink-stiffened fingers now drove stakes for communal gardens and built a small common granary where harvest might be stored for the weakest months. The granary was less about law than mutual insurance, an informal covenant written in sweat, not in legalese. Crane walked these new rows with a particular quietness, his steps careful as someone newly apprenticed to humility. He could not practice the way he had. His hands still bore the marks of fever and labor, the tremors slow to recede, and yet he found ways to be useful that required no ledgers, teaching a mother how to dress a wound without sutures, showing a boy how to boil rhubarb for a fever D, kneading bread with fingers that once held scalpel and ink. He moved among the people like a man learning each day to give without tally, watching the small economies of kindness settle like dust onto the town's surfaces. Neighbors traded chores instead of acres, and evenings hummed with the sound of shared work rather than the low mutter of contracts being calculated. There were awkward moments, old grudges like roots that rose when turned, but the impulse to rebuild something that belonged to everyone proved stronger than the urge to keep what one man had once hoarded. Where Crane's ledger had once lain heavy with names, the community planted an orchard, a deliberate, symbolic act of planting instead of signing, of choosing life over claim. Each tree was planted by a pair of hands, sometimes two strangers, who would, in future summers, sit beneath its shade without asking a title. The orchard grew into a slow, breathing monument to a different sort of property, one not owned but tended. Its first bloom was a small, defiant miracle that people spoke of for years. Crane himself found an odd peace in the anonymity of helping. No one called him doctor with that clipped edge of expectation. They called him Elias sometimes, and when they did, there was a tenderness that felt like permission to be a flawed man rather than an authority. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was with the spare cadence the town had come to expect, and those words often carried more weight now because they were given without leather's meaning. Redemption, he learned, was not a single blaze or a single ledger burn. It was a long, stubborn tending over seasons, showing up during planting, bringing a basket of seedlings, teaching a neighbor to splint a broken arm, acts that accumulate like compost and feed new growth. There were still practical reckonings, as Pact visited again, and this time negotiations were public and thinly polite. The state required paperwork and hearings, and some deeds, irreparably complicated, had to be settled in courts that it spoke a language both foreign and necessary. The town endured those intrusions, argued and compromised, and generally preferred the messy, human arrangements they had invented to the cold, legal arithmetic that had once concentrated land in one ledger. Children grew up knowing the stories. Some said the clinic had burned because Crane had set it alight in atonement. Others told of a man who learned too late. Those stories softened with repetition until they read like parables in the mouths of elders sitting in the orchard shade, telling new generations that no single man should keep a town's breath. In those long afternoons, Crane would wander to the fence lines now open and lean a hand on a post, feeling the pulse of a place repaired by many hands, and he understood at last that what he had once tried to secure through ownership could only be preserved by shared labor and shared sorrow and shared reparations. The town rebuilt not by erasing the past but by weaving it into the present. Ashes turned to soil, ledgers turned to stories, contracts turned into conversations, and while not every wound was healed, the communal work had given Rat Hollow a new, quieter kind of wealth, the knowledge that land could feed more than a man's ledger, that mercy given freely sometimes returns in abundance, and that redemption, unlike greed, has the patience to grow. Years had a way of blunting edges and tenderizing memory, and when the marker went into the soft soil at Red Hollow's edge, it read like a small, honest sentence meant to hold a complicated life in plain light. Here lies Elias Crane. He healed the sick, and himself. Children ran through the grasses that bent like old hands under a gentle wind, and the marker stood modest, not ostentatious, a slab of stone that caught sun and shadow in equal measure. To some it was a memorial, to others a cautionary tale, and to a pragmatic few it was simply a weathered piece of the landscape that told the town where a man had once walked and finally paused. Years had folded the fever into story and the fire into a lesson, and Red Hollow's faces carried softer lines now, not from forgetting but from the slow accretion of ordinary days in which people tended wounds and seeds, in which grudges thinned like old cloth left to the sun. Mothers brought their children to the orchard that had grown where ledgers once lay, and men who had once argued over boundaries now traded jokes over fence posts, the sound of laughter less brittle than it had been when survival sharpened every exchange. A child, small and curious, tugged at his mother's sleeve and pointed toward the stone. "Mama, who was Elias Crane?" he asked, as children ask about names that live in story more than memory. The mother paused a moment, watching the wind move through the grass as if the land itself answered, and then she smiled, an expression that had the softness of one who had seen much and chosen a particular mercy in reply, and said, "A man who learned that some debts can only be paid in kindness." Her voice carried a hint of the old years, of loss and of coming back together, and when she spoke the words they were not a neat summation but a living thing, open enough to include fault and atonement both. People remembered Crane in fragments, the thin lamp in a night of coughs, a hand steady in the dark, a ledger heavy with ink, a man burning his claims and standing naked in the ashen light. Some told it as a story of sin, some as a story of salvation. Most told it as a story of being human in a place that demands impossible choices. The town had reshaped itself around those choices, like a potter working clay until it held water again. They had chosen communal fields and shared granaries, and in the quiet hours one could see the ripple of that choice in the way neighbors laid out boards to fix roofs together or left a jar of preserves on a widow's stoop without asking anything in return. The marker's stone gathered lichens and small birds landed on it, leaving tiny scratches that time would soften. The inscription dulled in the rain and shone when the sun came, and both effects suited it. For the truth of a life is rarely a single tone, but many. Elders with hands like maps of toil would sit on the bench by the marker and recount how the ledger had once stacked like a wall around the clinic, how it had carved futures into parcels, and how a single night of flame had unleashed the town from the geometry. Stories told not to romanticize the burning, but to remind listeners that the work of rebuilding is always slow and often unglamorous. Children learn Crane's story in snippets: a doctor, a fire, an orchard. They learn that people make mistakes and sometimes make amends, and that both things can be true at once. On certain mornings, when the lights landed just so, old men would pause at the marker, rest a palm on the cool stone, and bow their heads not in judgment but in something like gratitude, for survival, for second chances, for the fact that the town had chosen to plant rather than to possess. The grasses whispered over the years, carrying seeds and small confessions on their backs, and the wind softened the scratch of memory into a susurrus that sounded almost like forgiveness. In the distance, the bell no longer kept a ledger of loss. It simply called people to work or to ceremony, or sometimes to sit in the churchyard and tell stories of how they nearly lost everything and how they did not. Crane's name, once a shard that grated between hungry teeth, had settled into the town's vocabulary as a crooked but hearn parable. Not a clean saint, not a villain reduced to a single sin, but a man who had learned the geometry of debt and decided, laden imperfectly, to repay it in labor and care. As the child skipped away, cheeks flushed and pockets full of small discoveries, the mother watched him go and felt a steadier peace than she had carried in years. The marker stood in the breeze, its letters softened by time, and the town moved around it like a living thing that remembers its past, not to be haunted by it but to be guided by it, toward neighborliness, toward hands that bind rather than bind up, toward the slow, patient economy of kindness that finally, in the end, repaid what no ledger ever could. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.